Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good whenever you're tuning in. Time for part two. I'm going to show you how I actually make the sourdough bread. So I hope you enjoyed the first part last night where I showed you how we prep the starter for use the next day. If you liked that video, please make sure that you like my page, follow. It really helps my channel grow and I appreciate the support. So coming to the bread now. We've got our starter that's been out for about 11 and a half hours, this one. So it's probably tough to see on the video here, but you can see that there's no like nice dome to the top of it. That's because it's starting to collapse on itself. So like I mentioned yesterday, this is when I want to be using the starter. If I were to let it go all the way back down to where this elastic is, where it started at, that would be too late and it wouldn't be very active. Right now, it's super active, it's still quite bubbly, and it's good to go. So you can smell the starter as well. That's another good indication of whether it's ready to use. It should be sort of yeasty with a bit of a tang to it. If it's smelling vinegary or like really, really sour, or if there's any alcohol formed on the top, that's a good indication that it's gone on too long and it's probably not going to give you the best rise. So we take our starter. Now this was measured out. I can dump everything into this bowl because I had two separate containers, as you know, because you watched the video yesterday. So I'm just going to take my starter out. I'm just going to dump it into this big metal bowl here. So a couple things about my recipe. I sort of use a bit of a combination of both baker's percentages and my own math. So a baker's percentage is a calculation of the ingredients relative to the amount of flour used. So when I'm saying that my recipe here is 65% hydration, what I mean is, for every 100 grams of flour, there's 65 grams of water. Sourdough breads tend to be a little bit higher in hydration than, the average yeasted bread that you're going to be used to dealing with. You can go as high as 100%. It does depend on the flours and everything that you're using. So I try to keep my recipe nice and simple, or as simple as possible for sourdough. So I'm skipping out on anything like if you're reading online, you'll see something called an autolyse period. That's where you soak the water and the flour for a couple hours prior to adding any starter or salt. I think it makes more sense in large batches in sort of bakery-sized productions, but for what I've done at home, I've tested it both ways. I don't notice any difference. So same like I did yesterday, I've got my starter in the bowl. I'm going to take my water here, add that in, and then just mix it up to dissolve. So as I was saying just now, I use a couple different percentages. So if you look in my recipe, you'll notice that along sort of the left-hand side with the ingredients, I've got a whole bunch of numbers there. So that is if you wanted to have a specific amount of dough. So say for my example, this will be a 2,350 gram batch of dough. The percentages that are on the left-hand side of my recipes there are used to calculate the amount of ingredients necessary to get to that final amount of dough. So it's different than the baker's percentage. And the only reason I do this is just because I found it easier when I needed to plan for having a certain amount of dough. Those numbers were just easier to work with than sort of working backwards from a baker's percentage. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know. I can explain to you a little further. Send me a message. So I've dissolved my starter in the water here. And I'm going to come on over and I'm going to dump in my flour. So this is 2,350 grams of dough that I'm going to get at the end here. So that was roughly 120 grams starter, a little bit more, a little bit less, not a big deal. I've got 873 grams of water. I'm going to add 1,336 grams of flour and then 23.5 grams of salt. So I have mixed up my flour already. I use 25% whole wheat and then 75% all-purpose unbleached. You can experiment with different flours. Just know that the higher in whole wheat and sort of heartier grains you go, it is going to require a little bit more water. So this recipe works great for the proportions that I'm using. If you're starting with a lot of rye flours or spelt, you might need a little bit more water. And again, I can help you with that. Send me a message. We'll figure it out together. So if you're wondering what this is here, this is called a Danish dough hook. It's basically like a bread whisk. So this batch right here would not work in my KitchenAid mixer. I don't have one big enough, unfortunately. Um, I would say if you've got sort of a standard 5-quart KitchenAid, which is what most people opt for, I wouldn't go any higher than about 1,200, maybe 1,400 grams. And the reason is the mixers can't handle it. It's a very dense dough sourdough, and you don't want to strip the gears or do any damage to your machine. I can speak to that personally, having done some damage to my machine. If you have one of the bigger mixers, like the professional series, like the 600 or the 700, you could probably handle, maybe up to like 1,700, 1,800 grams of dough, but honestly, I just find it easier to do by hand. If you were using a KitchenAid, you would just kind of pulse the water and the starter, get it all dissolved in there, add your flour and salt, and you would just mix on two, just basically until everything has come together, but not until a smooth ball has formed, because that's not how sourdough works. It's more of a measure or a function of time that gets you that smooth, nice taut dough than kneading in the initial phases. So I'm just taking my dough hook here, and I'm kind of just working it through, making sure there's no large clumps of flour. I'm about 50% of the way through mixing, and I'm just going to add my salt now. So you can add the salt with the flour along at the start. I haven't found that it makes any big difference. Some people say that you should only add the salt like an hour or two into the process. Again, sourdough has been around for thousands and thousands of years. There's just so many different ways of doing it, different approaches to it. So I can't say that one method is better than the other or one method is foolproof. This is just what works for me in Calgary's climate. So this is what I'm sharing with everyone. So I'm just working that dough hook through still, making sure that there's no dry parts of flour. It's not going to form like a nice tight ball, like I said. You just want to make sure that there's no super dry clumps of sort of unmixed flour. So yeah, if you were using a regular whisk at this stage, you'd have broken it already. This has a nice thick wire to it, so that's why it works for dough. So once I'm most of the way mixed here, I'm going to throw on some gloves, and I'm going to finish mixing by hand. You don't have to use gloves. I just find it a little bit easier. The dough sticks to my hands less, and I have to wash my hands a few times less, which we're doing enough nowadays anyways. So, totally optional. So again, I'm not kneading the dough. I'm basically just pinching it, and I'm just making sure that all the flour has been absorbed into this kind of shaggy mass here. We're going to form the gluten in the sourdough over the next few hours. So unlike, a yeasted bread where you're mixing until it forms that smooth ball, you do not want to be doing that here because you'll actually overwork the gluten. And then when you go to shape the dough, it won't hold its shape very well. It won't form a nice tight ball, and you'll cause yourself a few more problems. So 65% is on the dry end for sourdough. So it's a bit of a hand workout here you're going to have. Like I said, you can go up to 100%, and you'll end up sort of with basically just a very similar texture to what the starter was. So it doesn't look like a dough at all at that point, but as a function of time, the sourdough starts to sort of take on that familiar kind of dough-like texture. So right now it's just very dense, doesn't feel light, doesn't feel airy. You'll have to use your hands to sort of get a feel for the dough, and that's one of those indicators that you'll pick up and get better on as you go through it. But just sort of pay attention to how the dough feels right now, how dense it is, because when we come to our folds later, we're going to pay heed to sort of how the dough feels in our hands. Because like I said in my earlier video, it's a different process for everybody. Depends on the temperatures in your house, depends on a whole bunch of factors. So while I suggest 6 folds, you may only need 5 if your house is running a little bit warmer or if your dough was sort of responding quicker. I'll just show you guys sort of what we got here. So this is it. No obvious dry clumps, but it's still kind of shaggy. Doesn't really look like much. And that's perfect. So again, I'm just using room temperature water for this. As you get more involved in the process and a little bit more comfortable with managing the variables, you can use some higher temperature water, and that will help to reduce the time that you need between folds. So with everything at room temperature, I generally suggest about an hour between folds. You don't want to go anything less than 30 minutes because you'll start tearing the gluten. So that's it. We've mixed our sourdough. It's ready to sit for about an hour. I'm going to cover this with plastic wrap, and it's just going to sit out on the counter at room temperature. We'll come back in an hour, and I'll show you the first set of folds, and we're going to repeat that set of folds 5 to 6 times, depending on how the dough responds. Then we shape it twice, put it in our baskets or whatever we're going to proof it in overnight. It sits in the fridge for anywhere from 12 to 24 hours, and then we bake it the next morning. So in essence, it's a 3-day process. You can sort of condense things into 2 days by sort of prepping your starter super early in the morning and prepping the dough later in the afternoon, early evening. But that requires some very precise control over temperatures and manipulating the variables. So I don't suggest it to people at the start. I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, make sure you like my page, show some support. If you have any questions, either send me a message or put them into comments. I'm happy to help anyone along their sourdough journeys here. So I hope you enjoyed, and happy baking, everybody. Hey everyone, so it's been about an hour since we mixed up the dough initially. It's just been sitting on my counter with some plastic wrap here. I do apologize, you're not going to be seeing as much of my face for the next few videos. I just want to focus on what's important, which is the dough. I'm going to put on a glove here, just again, I find it easier to handle the dough that way, less sticking. Not necessary though. So what is helpful, however, is a spray bottle, just so that you can work with the dough without it sticking to you, because it's not well kneaded and it sticks and it's a bit of a pain. So I'm just going to spray my hand a bit. And this is what's called a stretch and fold. So I scoop up around the dough, just kind of lifting it off the bottoms of the bowl. Just loosening it up from the sides there. And you're gonna have to probably spray your hands a couple times. If you don't have a spray bottle, just sort of dip your hand in some water. But here's the idea. So you stretch and you fold. So I don't know how well you guys can see in the video here, but the dough still kind of has some lumps to it. It doesn't look super smooth. So I'm just picking it up, stretching it basically until just about it starts to rip a little bit, and I pat it back down sort of on the far side of it, thus stretching and folding. So I'm just going to work my way around the bowl. First couple folds, you'll probably be able to do this, 10, 12 times. Again, you're not kneading. It's not going to look like a smooth dough yet. You're just stretching it out, and this helps develop the gluten. So you'll see here, like it's already stretching a lot less than what it was, 5 or 6 folds ago. So this is my indicator that I'm good for this round of folding. It's tearing quite easily. I don't want to be tearing the gluten. I just want to be stretching and sort of massaging it. So you can leave the dough like this. I'm a little bit extra, and I like to kind of see the smooth top as it develops. So I'll scoop my hand around and kind of just flip the dough in its bowl here. So you can see it's kind of got a bit of a smooth top to it. It's still a little shaggy. It definitely has not shown really any signs of rising at this point in time, and that's okay. And when you poke it, it is firm. Like this is still very hard. You don't feel any pockets of air in it. And again, that's normal. This is how sourdough works. It's a process and it's a function of time. So that starter is now activating with the water and flour that we've added to it. It's gonna, use that as its new food source, which will cause it to grow, much like it did when you just had the starter. And additionally, it's going to sort of ferment, and that's where that flavor starts to develop from. So because I'm using the 5% recipe here, I'm definitely going to need at least 6 folds, and I probably won't be seeing much in the way of rising till about fold 4, maybe 5 even. If you're using like my 20% recipe, by about fold 3, 4, you should be seeing some obvious signs of rising. The more starter you use in the actual dough, interestingly enough, actually makes it less sour. So having less starter and a longer fermentation period will make the flavor stronger. And again, everything comes down to personal preference and what works for you. So you'll have to find what works in your kitchen for your preference, for your tastes. So here's what our dough is finishing off like. Again, I'm going to cover with plastic wrap. I'm going to come back in about an hour here, and I'm going to do another set of folds. And that's it. So it's not a huge investment of time. It's just you have to keep coming back to it regularly. So it's definitely a lot more work than your standard yeast bread. But when you look at the recipe and it says 8 hours, it's not like you're slaving away for those full 8 hours. So that's what we're at. Again, I keep my kitchen sort of around 70 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. If your kitchen's considerably colder, you may need to put the bread in the oven, either with the light on or off, just to add a little bit more heat and make sure that the process goes according to schedule. You never want to go above 90 degrees Fahrenheit because that's about the temperature where you start to kill off and damage those cultures. So that's all for now. We'll be back in an hour, and you guys will see more of the process as we go through. We are back for fold number 2. Again, keep the hand wet, just with some water here. I'm scooping around the sides of the bowl just to lift it all up so I can do those folds easier. And just pull it up. And notice how far it's stretching on these first couple of pulls. So I'm no longer seeing any like huge, I wasn't seeing any lumps of flour before. Just pulling it up. And you're starting to see a little bit of tearing. So it means I'm going just a little hard. And now it's not really stretching as far. So that's a good sign that we are done. Do just a couple more just to make a tight little ball. Flip it over, and here we are. So dough's still very firm. I'm seeing just a little bit of like tiny bubbles on the surface of it. Some initial signs of rising, but nothing super significant, no huge expansion yet. But we will get there. This is still on schedule and par for the course for my 5% recipe. So check back in an hour. Time for fold number 3. So if you look, it looks like the bread's starting to expand a little bit in between our folds here. So it's got some signs of rising, which is exactly what we're hoping to see. So if I flip it over, I can start to see where some bubbles have basically formed. I can see that the dough is expanding a little bit. Keep the hands wet. And it's no longer stretching quite as much as it was for those first 2 series of folds. So that just means that we've got some gluten forming, and that is perfect. And while I'm doing these folds too, I can see a few air bubbles are getting squished out. So because I'm using like a lower hydration as far as sourdoughs go, this dough will start to show good signs of gluten development much quicker than, say, if you were going with, like a 75 or, 80% hydration dough. And that's part of the reason why I like it, is that it's easy to share. And if you're not super familiar with sourdough bread or even bread making generally, you start seeing results quickly into the process. Whereas with, an 80% hydration dough, it's basically just going to look like starter and look like gloop for, the better part of 6 hours. So while it is looking nice and smooth on the top there, it's still not quite ready. So when I poke the dough, it's still very, very firm. And at this point, it hasn't really had a ton of time to ferment and develop air bubbles and get that sour flavor. So while it is smooth, we're still a ways away from actually being ready to shape this and, put it in our baskets and actually put it in the fridge overnight. But it is developing, and that's the key to this, is that you kind of have to have a little bit of faith at the start of the process that this massive shaggy dough will eventually turn into delicious sourdough bread. So that's it. That's all. Like I said, it's not a ton of work, every hour. It is just something that you have to do. So time for fold number 4. All right. So again, dough's definitely showing some signs of rising in between our folds here. It still feels quite dense. I don't see a ton of air bubbles, but it is getting less dense. Like, it's definitely changing in texture. You see like the indents when I poke with my finger, they now sort of stay there. So let's do our folds and then we'll check it out. So yeah, the dough is not stretching as much as it did those first 2 rounds. It's holding a lot better, like it's not ripping when I do these folds. Again, I'm seeing a few little air bubbles when I squish it down. All in all, things are progressing as they should. And when I smell it now, it smells kind of a little bit yeasty, not super sour, but there's definitely something happening here. The magic is happening. Everything is working. Sourdough, you got to kind of rely on faith a little bit that things are working. So there we go. I'm going to flip it over. So it's actually forming quite a nice ball right now. It's nice and smooth on the top of it. When I poke, it is still quite firm. So definitely not ready to shape or anything like that yet. If you're using the 20% or the 10% recipe, you should be seeing some decent signs of rising and sort of proof that the fermentation is happening around the 4th fold. With the 5% one, it takes a little bit longer. So again, that's all we want for now. We're going to cover it back up with plastic wrap and come back to it in an hour. So while I'm waiting for my dough for another hour here, just going to put that off to the side. Time we deal with Banneton baskets. So these are something that I like to use to proof the bread in overnight. They are 100% not necessary, especially while you're starting out and you're not really sure how committed you are to the sourdough process. If you don't want to buy the Bannetons or you just want to sort of try things out, what I suggest you start with is take a colander, line it with a clean tea towel, and use that. It works just as well. You might not get as pretty of a loaf. It might sort of spread out a little bit more depending on the size of your colander. But you want something that allows a little bit of airflow around the bread. So here's what I like to do. So here's my Banneton basket after, I last used them about a week ago. So you can see there's some sort of remnants of hardened flour that's stuck in there, and that's okay, that's gonna happen. What we do is we build up what I like to call a seasoning. If you use cast iron, you'll know what seasoning means. So basically it's a layer that's going to exist between the bread and the basket that helps to prevent it from sticking. So what I do is I spray down my basket using my handy water bottle here, just getting things a little bit damp. Now I take a blend of 50-50 rice flour and whole wheat flour. If you don't have any rice flour, I would say just use whole wheat. The all-purpose isn't great for this just because it ends up sticking to the bread more than anything. Rice flour really is a good thing to have while you're doing the sourdough process. So all I'm doing, I dumped a little bit in there, and I'm just kind of moving it around, just making sure that that flour sticks wherever I sprayed inside my Banneton basket. So you'll have a little bit of extra left in the basket, so I'm going to dump that back into my original container. And now you can see this one compared to this one. So we've got a whole bunch more flour in this one that will prevent the bread from sticking when we knock it out tomorrow. So I'm just going to go through, do the same thing with this one here. And I'm going to actually do it with all three of my Bannetons right now. So you want to do this kind of, a couple hours before you're actually going to shape and knead them. Just that way the flour has time to dry inside the baskets and really prevents the chance of sticking. Again, Banneton baskets are not 100% necessary, especially when you're starting out and you're kind of unsure if you're really going to commit to this labor of love that is sourdough. Save yourself a little bit of money, use a colander and a tea towel when you're first getting started. And if you find that you're making breads regularly, then take the splurge. They'll cost anywhere from kind of, $15 to $30, depending on how many you're buying, where you're buying them from, and the size of the baskets. But I do recommend them if you're really baking bread often. They are quite nice. You don't want to be using something like a traditional sort of coated loaf pan, like something with a Teflon or a non-stick coating. The reason is that the acidity from the sourdough bread will react with that coating and will actually start to break it down. And same thing if you were to use like a raw aluminum pan. So this is not based on personal experience. This is just kind of what I've read online. I am not a scientist, so if someone wants to chime in and correct me and let us know that the aluminum pans or the Teflon pans are fine to use, please do so. I won't be offended. This is just sort of what I've learned, what I've picked up, and sort of what I know. The other thing you want with your proofing basket is you want something that's open on the top. You don't want to use like a sealed container or anything, because you do want a little bit of airflow around the bread. What that'll do is it'll kind of create a little bit of a skin on the bread, and that makes it easier to score the next morning. So there we are. Now all of our baskets are nice and seasoned. So I'm just going to knock this off. And that's good. So we're going to wait another sort of 45 minutes almost now before I do my next set of folds. Our baskets will be ready to use when we need them. And so far everything's going according to plan. We're on fold number 5. Let's take a look at our dough, see how it's progressing. All right. So definitely rising a bit in between folds. So nice and smooth looking on the top right now. When you flip it over, you can see that there's some obvious signs that there's some bubbles growing in there. So that's Something I like about the 5% dough is that you kind of have a little bit more control over the proofing times just because there's a little bit less starter. The downside of it is you're kind of working on a little bit of faith that everything's going to rise like right near the end in the last couple hours. Around this fifth fold here, so I'm just going to show you. So you see little bubbles as I'm making those folds that are getting squished out. There's signs of rising. It's just not huge yet. With the 10% or the 20% loaf, you would be seeing a lot more rising by this point in time. And in fact, if your house is pretty warm, you might actually not even need that sixth fold. So that's something you'll kind of have to play around and figure out for yourself. Again, when I poke the dough, it still feels quite firm. It doesn't really have a ton of air trapped inside. There's a few little bubbles that I can see on like the top skin of the dough, but it's still not quite there where I'd want to be starting to shape it yet. You know, sourdough is a bit of a process. It's a learning curve. You have to figure out what works for you. So there will be some trial and error. But like I say, even bad sourdough makes great croutons. So hopefully everyone likes salad. And that's it for the fifth fold here. So we're going to come back in one more hour. We definitely need at least the 6 folds for this one. And we'll do the 6th fold. We'll wait another hour and then we'll start shaping everything. Time for our last fold. Let's check on how our dough is doing. Okay. So when I lift off the cover there, I can definitely smell a little bit of sourness, a little bit of yeastiness. It's clearly rising and changing in shape and volume between the folds here. So that's perfect. That's what we want to see. I can see little bubbles along the top of the dough as well, which is just more signs that rising's happening. So big thing I notice when I'm doing these stretches is that the dough kind of feels a little bit airier. There's definitely some bubbles that are going on. It also just feels a little bit lighter, like it's no longer as dense. And that's basically what we're going for. So unfortunately, I can't show you in a video how it feels, but this is something that you'll kind of pick up as you make a few loaves, is that you get a feeling for sort of when the dough is ready to be shaped, or when it's ready for the next step, or if it still needs more folds. So even after I've done that series of stretch and folds, I can still see more bubbles on the top of the skin of the dough, and that's perfect. And when I go to poke it, it feels more like what a yeasted dough feels like, what if you bake a bunch of other breads, what you'd be used to. So the indent kind of hangs out when you poke in the dough, but it bounces back slowly. It doesn't feel excessively hard. Generally, it feels like what you would expect your yeast doughs to feel like. So it only took us 6 hours, no big deal. But we're finally there. We're ready. So we're gonna let this sit for just about 1 more hour. So we've done our 6 full folds. We're gonna let it sit for an hour and then we'll start doing the shaping. The reason you don't want to start shaping right after this set of folds is because we've pulled all that gluten super tight. And if we were to now split and try and shape it up, we would just end up tearing a lot of the gluten and it would not work out as well. So you want to leave time in between all of your folds so that the dough can relax a little bit. So that's what we're doing here. We'll come back in 45 minutes and I'll disinfect my counters, and then we will do our first set of shaping. And soon we will have some actual bread here as opposed to just this big blob. Hello, sourdough friends. The time has come. We're going to shape our loaves. Yay! So I've left it about, it's been about 45 minutes since I did the last stretch and fold, maybe closer to an hour. Like I mentioned, you don't want to go straight from the last stretch and fold into shaping because the gluten will be too tight, just tearing things. So that's why we sort of wait that last hour. And I don't know how this is going to work. I've got the ring light on, so it might not color balance well. But the dough has shown some good signs of rising. It's much softer. It's the softest it's kind of been throughout this process. obviously. So just gonna grab a tool here, just a dough cutter. So I've got my scale again here because I'm gonna weigh out my loaves so that they're all the same shape, or so that I know what shape and size they're gonna be. This just has some all-purpose flour, so I'm just gonna lightly dust the top of my loaf, just so it doesn't stick to my counter. Kind of rub that in. You don't want to be adding a ton of flour because you don't want to be making the dough super dense or more dense than it already is. Just enough so that it doesn't stick. So put your bowl to the side. So now I've got my big massive dough, so I'm just going to kind of squeeze out any of the super large bubbles that may exist in there. And I'm going to start cutting it up to get to my 3 loaves I'm going to make out of this. So it was 2,350 grams. I've got 3 different bannetons. 2 of them are the same size, so I'm going for 850 grams for one and 750 for the other. No, you do not need to use a scale for this to be exact. That's just how I roll. So just put that aside for now. Okay. All right. So I've got my loaves here. So hopefully you guys can see this. I wish I had overhead cameras, but the YouTube studio isn't quite set up for that yet. So you take your piece of bread or your dough at this point, just make sure there's no big bubbles that still exist in it. And pulling from the edges, you're just going to go around in a circle and push them into the middle. And I'm just forming it into a ball here. So you could leave it like that. I like to make sure it's extra, extra tight. So I kind of push with my middle fingers into the center of it while I kind of hold it on the outside just to keep that tight ball shape. So pinch off the bottom. Perfect. And I'm just going to leave it on the counter like that. Get that out of the way so you guys can see. Same thing on this one. So pulling from the corners, just pulling into the center and working my way around, just getting into a nice tight ball shape. And the reason we want to keep a nice tight top to this is that creates surface tension, which later on when you go and cut it tomorrow morning, or when you score it, that surface tension is what helps to create the ear. So that's the little part of the sourdough that kind of lifts up from the rest of it. So just going around again, pulling from the outsides, pushing into the middle. So you want to be careful that you're not tearing the dough because you do want it to have a nice smooth top when you finish here. So, you know, this extra step that I do here, totally not necessary. But, you know, I have fun playing with the dough. So pinch off on the bottom again. Perfect. So we've got 3 nicely shaped loaves here. Leave these out on the counter. So these are going to sit for 30 minutes now, and then I'm going to do another shape. So if you remember, my bannetons are oval shaped. So I'm going to show you guys how I do oval shaped loaves today, or batards. And if you just had a circular banneton, or if you were using a colander with a tea towel, basically you would just do the exact same thing that I did here. So you'd kind of punch it down a little bit and form it up into a nice tight circle. It's a slightly different process for the batards, so that's what I'm going to be showing today. But the reason you want to do those 2 stretch and folds, you create that nice surface tension, it'll hold its shape in the fridge better, and it'll give you a beautiful loaf when we go to bake tomorrow. So that's it for now. I'll check back in about 30 minutes. It's time. We've got our second shaping before we start proofing the breads. For those of you who have hung around this long into the video and are still listening to my voice, congratulations. You clearly have some serious patience and have what it takes to be a sourdough master. So I'm just going to take plastic wrap off my breads. So I don't know if you guys can tell from when we last looked at them, but they're spread out a little bit more. I can see some little bubbles on the top of the dough. And basically everything is looking good, exactly as I'd want it to be. So I got my Banneton basket here. Again, not necessary if you don't have one. You could just use a tea towel that's been sort of lined with, or sorry, a colander lined with a tea towel that you spray with some water and add a flour mixture, preferably whole wheat and rice flour. Same as what I did for the basket here. So again, apologies that I don't have an overhead camera or any fancy studio equipment. I hope you guys can kind of see what I'm doing. So I'm stretching out the dough. I kind of want to make it a bit of an oblong shape. So looks kind of like that. And I'm going to pinch from the top two corners, fold in towards the middle, and then I'm just pinching and rolling the dough down. So there's a bunch of different techniques you can use for how to shape your dough. Everyone kind of does it a little bit differently. The thing is, the dough is going to be sitting in the fridge, it's going to be proofing, it's going to be rising, so it doesn't have to look picture perfect, and this is something that you will get better with as you practice more. So I'm just going to pinch up the seams, and as you can see, it's kind of a nice oval shape here. Exactly what we want. Don't mind my oven beeping in the background. All right. So, got my dough sitting in a basket. It's going to sit there for about another, let's say anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. It really depends on the temperature in your room, temperature of the dough before you shape it. Whole bunch of factors. Because I'm using the 5% recipe, I might need an hour proof time, possibly even up to an hour and a half. For the 10% and 20% recipes, 30 minutes will probably be good, assuming your starter was super active when you got going in the first place. So again, I've pinched the corners into the middle, pushed them in, and I'm just using my thumbs to kind of pull the dough back and roll in. And as I'm pushing down, I'm squishing out any major air bubbles. And if I make it look easy, it's because I've baked hundreds and hundreds of loaves. Again, if it doesn't look perfect, if it's not super smooth when you're shaping it, don't worry. The dough has a way of kind of working itself out and becoming a whole lot smoother as it proofs. So don't stress if it doesn't look perfect. You don't want to overwork the dough too much because you don't want to be ripping at the gluten and tearing, all of the work that you've built up over the last few hours. So again, picking it up, putting it in my Banneton basket. And I'll bring those up to the camera so you guys can see kind of where they're at right now, how high they are in the basket. And then I'll check back in before I move them into the fridge. And you can see how they're looking there. So because this is a bit of a lower hydration dough, I sort of recommend like a one-stage shaping process. There's other methods of shaping, especially for the batards out there online, but you kind of shape into an oval, then you reshape into an oval, then you roll it all up. Doing that sort of three-step process with a lower hydration dough like this, you're just going to end up tearing it. So that's why I kind of suggest you do one process to get it going, but you'll find out what works for you. So just pinching up those seams. Again, it doesn't look perfectly smooth on the bottom side here. And I forgot to mention, so the top side is nice and smooth. That's the side that I want to be putting down and into the basket. The sort of uglier side where I've pinched the seams, that's the one that's going to be facing up. Perfect. So I've got my 3 loaves all prepped now. I'm going to show you guys what they look like inside the baskets there. Hopefully you can get a good eye for it. So there's still a bunch of space around the sides of the loaf, and they're not anywhere near past the top of the basket. We'll check back in about, we'll start, 30 minutes, 45 minutes. I'll just keep an eye on them. I'll start recording basically at the time where I'm ready to put them in the fridge, and I'll tell you guys how long it's been. Unlike with yeasted doughs, you're not looking for it to double in size. If you do that, it will certainly be overproofed. You kind of want it to go maybe 20, 25% increase in size. Basically, it just needs to puff out a little bit from where it's at, just so that you know that it's still active, it's still working. Again, if your kitchen is super cold, you might want to use the oven with the light on, making sure that you're not going above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. But do not let it double in size, because it's going to go into the fridge overnight. And all that extra time, by the time you go to bake it the next morning, it'll be a little bit soft, because what happens with the sourdough is as the starter ferments and as the whole bread ferments, if it goes past a certain point, it will actually start to break down that gluten and it will sort of lose its shape. So the idea is that you want to be catching the dough before it's used up the entirety of its food source, before it's sort of totally peaked, so that it still has some energy left in it when it goes into the fridge, and then when it comes out of the fridge the next morning, so that when you bake it, there's still, some energy, some oomph left in there, so that when you score it and when you bake it, it rises up. Whereas if it's totally exhausted, it'll kind of just flatten out and become a bit of a sourdough pancake in the oven. So hopefully I haven't over-explained anything and you guys are still following along. We'll check back in. I'll let you guys know how it goes, how long it takes. Happy baking, everyone. Fingers crossed. I hope your loaves turn out great. The time has come. All that hard work is half paid off at least. We're going to take a look at our breads. We're going to see how well they've risen. And we're going to pop them into the fridge overnight for a little bit of a sleep before we bake them tomorrow. So I don't know how well the camera will show you here with the white balance. I'll have some still pictures, but the breads have risen, not double in size because we don't want that, but around that sort of 20% mark, 25% mark. There's still a nice rounded top to the bread. You know that you've overproofed and gone a little bit too far if the bread kind of puffs up and then starts to flatten out. You want it to have some semblance of the shape that you put it into the basket with, because when you come tomorrow morning and we're going to knock it out onto some parchment paper, if we've overproofed it, that gluten will have started to break down from the fermentation, and the bread will basically just spread out when we put it on the parchment paper, which will basically give us a bit of a flatter loaf than we want, and it just won't look as nice. It'll still taste good, but it won't look as pretty. And half the fun of sourdough is the Instagram pictures and being able to share the prettiness with everybody else. So I'm happy with where everything looks right now. So I'm going to take my covers that I have for my Banneton baskets, and I'm just going to put them back on. Now, if you don't happen to have a Banneton basket with a cover, or if you don't even have a Banneton basket, it's not a problem. We are just proofing these breads for about 12 hours. So you could put them into the fridge uncovered. It wouldn't be a big deal. It'll develop a bit of a skin on the outside of the dough, and that's okay. That'll kind of help us to get a good score on it. But we don't want it to go too far that we get like a thick crust on the bread before we actually bake it and get its actual crust. So that's why I like these covers. So I put the covers on and I spray them with just a bit of water before I pop them in the fridge. And that just adds a little bit of moisture for the dough to kind of latch onto. And that's also partially because I'm only using a 65% hydration. With a higher hydration dough, this isn't as much of an issue. If you don't have the covers, like I said, you could just use a big plastic bag and put the breads in the plastic bag, in their baskets, in the fridge. But it's one of those things that you'll kind of have to play around with and test for yourself. So it's been about an hour, 15 minutes since I did my second shaping. Like I mentioned before, there's a ton of variables to sourdough. There's no one recipe that'll work for everyone in every situation, 100% repeatable. You do have to play around for yourself and kind of figure out what works for you. Unfortunately, I don't have a commercial kitchen to be working in where I can, set the temperature exactly where I want. There's some fluctuations, and there will be for your house too. So you're going to have to sort of use a bit of a feeling and figure out what works well for you. Even if these first couple loaves don't turn out perfect for you, I've always said bad sourdough, bad sourdough makes great croutons. So hopefully everyone in your family likes salad, because there may or may not be a couple practice loaves along the way. So I'm going to pop these in the fridge. I'm going to do these 2 loaves will bake tomorrow morning. It'll be about 12 hours in the fridge at that point in time. This one I'm going to push to about 24, maybe 36 hours. I don't suggest going too much longer past that 36 hours because the fermentation will reach a point where it starts to break down the gluten. And again, this is a variable that's dependent on the amount of starter that's in your recipe. For the 10% recipe, you definitely don't want to be going past 24 hours. And for my 20% recipe, really 12 hours is unto itself pushing it, just because of the amount of starter in the recipe and how hungry the bread will be. So because I'm using the 5% one, I have a little bit more fluctuation I can do. I can sort of play with the variables a little bit more to proof it a little bit longer. But again, practice for yourself, figure out what works for you. We'll see the kind of difference between how this one rises versus how these 2 rise. This one won't rise quite as much, but it'll have a bit more of a sour flavor. Unfortunately, I can't show that to you guys on video. So that's it. Congratulations for getting through all these videos, for listening to me. I hope you guys learned something along the way. If you have any questions that I didn't answer, or if there's something that you've seen in another video that you want me to clarify, let me know. I'm happy to help you out. Before you go, please just make sure that you hit like on my page. Make sure you follow. I really appreciate the support, and it helps me to hit a bigger audience, whether it be for sourdough or for real estate. I'm really happy to help anyone with whatever questions they have. If your starter reaches an unfortunate demise and you need to pick up some more from me, don't hesitate to send me a message. And happy baking, everyone. I hope you enjoy the sourdough that you've all made. Sorry, one thing I forgot to mention. The temperature of your fridge will have a factor to play in how much your bread continues to rise while it's in there. So I have a tiny little bar fridge that I put most of my sourdough and my starter in because I bake so dang much and because I'm a little extra like that. So I keep that fridge somewhere between kind of 40 to 50 degrees roughly, depending on which shelf the breads go on. Your main fridge will probably be a little bit colder than that. So that's really why you want to make sure that you get a good proof on it before you put it in the fridge. Again, if your fridge is significantly warmer than that 50 degrees, you are going to have to make sure, A, that you get a new fridge, and B, that you don't proof it in there too long. So just forgot to mention that. Again, another fun variable to play with to make this recipe just a little bit trickier for you all. Anyways, that's it for me.